In February 1943, the largest group of Allied Special Forces soldiers set off on their first mission behind enemy lines. They would fight in the hot, stifling Burmese jungle, led by an onion-eating misfit by the name of Orde Wingate. These men, known as the Chindits, would go on to write their name in history as one of the most fearless and unconventional forces deployed during the Second World War. But who were the Chindits, and what did they do? Well, today I'll be looking at their history and their operations. There seems only one place to start, and that is with Orde Wingate, the man behind the concept of the Chindits. He was born in India in 1903, and his father also served in the army. Wingate spent most of his childhood back in England and went to Charterhouse School in Surrey. The school, interestingly, was founded in 1611. Upon completing his schooling in 1921, Wingate was then accepted into the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. Upon graduation, he commissioned as an officer in the Royal Artillery. Wingate was found to be an excellent officer. He had real talent in horse riding. He did, however, gain a reputation as someone who was late paying his mess bills, and he was disliked by a number of his colleagues for his supposedly insufferable attitude and rebellious streak. In 1928, Wingate was posted to the Sudan, and he spent several years in the country. He also spent some time in Libya, studying desert travel. In 1936, Wingate was stationed in British Palestine. While there, he set up the Special Night Squad, which were a group of British-led Jewish commandos who fought against the Arab guerrillas in the area. The unit used unconventional tactics and covertly assaulted the enemy. Arguably, commanding this unit led the foundation for Wingate's future Special Forces units. When the Second World War exploded to life in 1939, Wingate was in the UK, serving with an anti-aircraft unit. Not content with this, he was sent back to the Sudan, where he then went on to create Gideon Force to combat Italian troops in the area. The unit was made up of British troops as well as locals, and Wingate once again proved successful at creating a unit from a mixture of indigenous and Commonwealth troops. Gideon Force was incredibly successful. Using guerrilla tactics, the unit penetrated deep into Italian lines, and at one point, with a force of just over 1,700, they captured over 20,000 Italians. Despite his success, Wingate was sent home after a bout of illness, and also after writing a report criticising his fellow officers, as well as the government, amongst others. But through political intervention, Wingate was saved from spending his days in England, and by 1942 he was sent to the Far East and to Rangoon in Burma, where he would go on to create his most famous unit, the Chindits. After the British Indian Army was kicked out of Burma, Wingate felt that his exploits in Africa and the Middle East would work against the now rampant Japanese army. Others clearly felt the same way. And Wingate was given command of the 77th Infantry Brigade, from which he created the Chindits. Wingate immediately began training his men in jungle warfare. Their training was brutal, and he attempted to toughen the men by making them train and camp in the Indian jungle during rainy season, a decision which backfired as many of the unit became unwell, and many suffered from malaria and dysentery, rendering them out of action. And in fact, conditions became so bad that replacements had to be brought in from other units. The men that went on to continue their training, however, became very disciplined troops, able to live in tough conditions and march with heavy equipment through the jungle. Wingate led from the front, as he had with all the other units he created. His quirks became more bizarre with the Chindits, however. He would greet people in his tent naked, eat raw onions, and clean himself with a rubber brush. He also had a disregard for army regulations. In some regards, however, it did make perfect sense. He grew a beard and allowed his men to do the same, for fear of infection from shaving in the jungle. By February 1943, Wingate and the Chindits were ready to deploy, and they did so, in Operation Longcloth. The Chindits set off across the Chidwin River in mid-February 1943. There, they split into 8 columns, each with around 340 men. Each column was strong enough to attack and defend itself against the Japanese, but small enough to disappear into the jungle and be able to conceal itself. If needed, the columns could combine themselves to create a larger force to take on bigger Japanese targets. 2 days into the operation, and the Japanese were found, and a series of firefights broke out. Whilst close to the Allied lines, the Chindits received air support and supply drops. This also gave the illusion to the Japanese that the force was greater than it was. Initially, the Chindits had success, and they took out railway lines in several locations and played havoc behind the lines. But working and living behind the lines was tough for the men, and the jungle was an unforgiving and hellish environment. But as they proceeded deeper into Burma, the Chindits found the terrain much different. The area became dry and inhospitable, and things became tougher once the Japanese began to intercept their supply drops. The Chindits soon found themselves exhausted, exposed to disease, and with shortages of food, water, medicine, and ammunition. Due to these issues, the columns were ordered back to India. The route back was hellish for the men. The Japanese, aware of the Chindits, now patrolled the rivers, and the men were forced to split into smaller groups to escape. Many did not, and they became lost in the jungle, captured or destroyed by the Japanese. Of the 3,000 original Chindits who set off on Operation Longcloth, a third, just over 800 men, had been captured or succumbed to disease or the enemy. Of the remaining 2,000, over 600 men were too sick or injured to return to duty. Of the remaining men, Wingate handpicked those he wished to keep in the unit, while the others were sent back to their original battalions. After the operation, many high-ranking officers viewed the Chindit expedition with mixed feelings. On an operational level, they hadn't really achieved that much, but in terms of its effect on propaganda, they were a raging success. It showed the British people, and the army, that the Japanese were not unbeatable in the jungle, and that the British soldier was more than a match for them. To the chagrin of some, a second operation was greenlit for the Chindits, codenamed Operation Thursday. It would include more men, air power, and establishment of bases behind the lines. 20,000 men would be provided for this new operation in March 1944, and they were given the new name of Special Force. The unit was given its own air force, the 1st Commando Air Group, who would provide supplies, casualty evacuation, and support. British, Gurkha, Burmese, Indians, and African troops all combined to create this new force, whose plan was to establish bases behind the lines, from which the Chindit columns could strike the Japanese at shorter distances. To set up these initial bases, the units would be deployed via glider. Once these bases had been established, transport aircraft would then land in nearby airstrips. Tragedy struck for the Chindits, however, in the first few weeks of the operation. Whilst returning from a meeting with other senior commanders, Orde Wingate's aircraft crashed into the jungle, taking him and 9 others with it. The Chindit operations carried on, a blight under new leadership. But without Wingate's leadership, plans for them were changed. They were eventually given to Joseph Stilwell's Americans, who misused them as frontal assault troops, and they made attacks without proper support, equipment, or training, resulting in higher levels of casualties. By the war's end, the Chindits had suffered terribly. Many lost up to a third of their body weight, and collected a raft of diseases and injuries, some of which they kept for life. The legacy of the Chindits is somewhat mixed. Historians are split on their effectiveness. Some praise the Chindits for their unconventional methods and their ability to take the fight to the Japanese. Others believe that the time spent training, the experienced manpower and equipment used and lost, didn't result in a net gain in terms of military success. What they did do was cause the Japanese to alter their own plans and reinforce areas that they previously thought were impassable. They also brought a terrific amount of positive propaganda at a time when British morale in India was low. They helped dispel the idea of Japanese invincibility in the jungle. They also helped give the Allies an advantage in terms of air supply techniques and organisation by showing leaders that units could be resupplied by air despite being cut off and surrounded. To throw in my opinion to the mix, the Chindits are some of the toughest men the British Army's ever had, living and fighting in some of the worst conditions in the war. And in 2015, the British Army created a new formation as a tribute to the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, which went on to become the Chindits. The new formation badge is a modern update on the original Chindits badge. If you know anyone who served in the Chindits, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you all on the next one. Goodbye.